Many people still talk about the so-called generous offer of Camp David II, where Barak and the Israelis were going to give the Palestinians over 90% of the West Bank, and how Arafat and the Palestinians declined.
What Barak was offering in terms of the land deal was, I would say, 80% of the West Bank and Gaza, but not contiguous. Basically, keeping most of the settlements intact and the Israelis living in the settlements in blocks. And so what we were going to have were 3 separate blocks of Palestinians with bypass roads in the middle, sort of bordering as moats around these Palestinian areas. And then in key strategic areas, especially on the borders, we'd have the settlement blocks. And the Jewish settlements and the Jewish population in the settlements would be living this privileged life, as I was talking about, under a completely separate body of law, with total freedom of movement, that block, while the Bantustan would be subject to permits, would be subject to military order, etc. There would not be any viable independence, and the Israelis would still maintain control of the larger picture.
What this map tries to show is in the green, dark green and light green, which are areas A and B, how the Palestinian areas are so carved up into little tiny enclaves. That this is, in a sense, what the Palestinian state would be.
This is certainly not liberation. This is not autonomy. This is not dignity. And of course, the issue of Jerusalem was not clear. And what about the refugees? In Gaza, 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees living in refugee camps. They are not from Gaza. Their homes, their land is from Israel, what is known as Israel today. In the West Bank, there are hundreds and thousands of Palestinian refugees. So if you were going to make a Palestinian state in Gaza, that may liberate the Palestinians who are originally from Gaza, because they got rid of the occupation, but the refugees from Gaza stay in the camps. Plus, the refugees who are living inside Israel. There are about 600,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel today who are what we call internally displaced refugees. They're living in Israeli cities because they were thrown off their lands in what are now probably kibbutzim. So all those issues were just thrown away. And of course the prisoner issue, there was no guarantee of release. And the prisoner issue touches every Palestinian. Almost every Palestinian family has had a family member in prison. Put this all together, Arafat couldn't have signed this. Clinton wanted to go down in history as making this historical agreement. Barak was losing his popularity. He needed this peace agreement to continue. And they both, for political reasons, pushed Arafat. When Arafat said no, Clinton got on Israeli TV and blamed Arafat. And Ehud Barak demonized Arafat. Shlomo Ben Ami blamed it all on Arafat. And a month later we had the Intifada. And from that on, the attempt to exclude Yasser Arafat, an elected leader, from the whole process. And in Gaza and the West Bank are locked into Gaza, the West Bank. Some people say, so what? I mean, why do they need to go into Israel anyway? Well, we have to look at the context. Since 1967, the Israelis have confiscated over 60% of Palestinian land in the West Bank. And the Palestinian economy was mostly land-based. Without the land, Palestinians were forced to be day laborers in Israel. And that was a primary source of income. In addition, under occupation, the Israeli military never allowed the Palestinians to develop an independent and viable economy in the West Bank and Gaza. So Palestinians were always dependent on money and income from working in Israel, most of them. In 1993, with the Oslo process, unfortunately, the Israelis implemented the closure, which shut the doors to Israel. And so hundreds and thousands of Palestinians suddenly became unemployed. And there was no alternative source of employment. During the Oslo process, unemployment tripled. During the peace process, unemployment tripled. And by the beginning of the Intifada, we have 1 million Palestinians living under the poverty line. And this is not a poor country. This is a country that always had, a reasonable standard of living. I would lift the closure. To me, the closure is a source of this humility and of a source of the need to resort to anything, to using your body, anything to protest the oppression. A man with 7 kids and no job, nothing to feed his kids, he will eventually go blow himself up. We've already seen the phenomenon of women now going and blowing themselves up. Why? I mean, they're using the last thing left to them to scream out, to protest. They're using their bodies. And I would lift the closure because, and just for an example, in the first Intifada, there was no closure. Palestinians were in and out of the West Bank. They were in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, working all over. All over. They were at the beaches. There wasn't one suicide bombing. Suicide bombing started with the closure. Americans really need to be educated because so much of their tax money is being used to oppress the Palestinians and is being used to advance a system of segregation and apartheid that the American people protested and now have declared unacceptable in their own country. And I always say to the Americans, if segregation is unacceptable to you, then why is it acceptable for our brothers and sisters in Palestine, Israel? If you said no then say no now. And say no with your money. Because I have been in Bethlehem for the last 2 weeks, and I know that the Israelis could not have carried out the killings and the destruction without the massive weaponry that they were using against Palestinians in Bethlehem without U.S. assistance. Those were American planes bombing us, American Apache helicopters shooting from the sky, M16s, and lots of money funding the Israeli army. Without that money, the Israeli army wouldn't have done what it did. It couldn't have. It doesn't have the money for it.
Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
The United States government is supporting it, and the American Congress and taxpayers are paying for it.
Without massive U.S. support, none of this can go on.
No other issue is treated in such a biased manner.
Because this is an issue of American foreign policy.
That is probably the reason why this stuff is simply censored out of the press.